Thanks, Enrique and Jessica, or Jessica, how they call you here, for hosting me, and also the Raoul Wallenberg Institute, Wolf and Peter for hosting me. The Fulbright Commission, of course, Emma and Eric, and my university too, for allowing me to take a year off on sabbatical. And my wife Gwen and my family who followed me in this journey, which has been great so far. It has been great to be here in Lund. It's a fantastic community. We're enjoying our time, and I'm happy to share some of my thoughts and my ideas, and looking forward to keep working with you for the remaining of my stay here. On to the topic of today's talk, which is the international scientific cooperation, in particular the duty and international human rights law. This is sort of a leftover project coming out of a book that was published last year with my co-author, Cesare Romano. It took us 7 years to write this book, so we decided we had enough and we wanted to get it published, but we had 2 chapters that were missing. One is international cooperation, and the other one is the regulation of the private sector in science and technology. So this is the language in the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights that creates an obligation to cooperate in scientific and cultural fields. And so the topic today is to look at the languages in this treaty, is more broadly the topic for my research project here as a Fulbright scholar. This is a little funny visualization created by Copilot. What I'm trying to say there is that my stay here is for 9 months, so this is month 3. So I don't have any definite thought about what I'm doing, and it's a work in progress. So I'm sharing what I've done so far, but it's much more to coming ahead. But I have some thoughts about this topic, and so I'm going to share them as we are today. Another piece of context is really to think about where this provision in the Human Rights Treaty is. And so the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was followed by 2 binding treaties in the 1960s. And if you look at the provision, the substantive provision, they articulate in Article 6 through 27 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and 6 through 15, or the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And now we are looking at Article 15, the last paragraph of that article. So we are really looking at the edges of international human rights law in many ways, something that is being forgotten for many years. So I ask also, this is actually not AI developed, but it's fiction, a map of fiction that somebody created of an island. And if you think about the political and civic rights, and then the economic, social, cultural rights, they're kind of in the middle of that island, and people really spend a lot of time thinking about them. And I am on the outskirts, like that neighborhood that nobody really visits, that hasn't yet to be discovered. It's a good thing as a scholar because there is not much written, but it's also a bit of a uphill battle to make it relevant to the right people. And I'm going to say a few things at the end about the renaissance in interest in science and human rights and technology human rights, but it's still a bit much at the outskirts of the mainstream human rights discourse. So that's the language of the Covenant, and has been mostly ignored by scholars and practitioners. So we really don't know much about what it means really to have, for states to have an obligation to engage in international competency cooperation. It's part of a cluster of rights called the cultural rights that are also have, received much less attention by scholar and practitioner over the last 80 years. Both understudied and underapplied, but there's a renaissance of interest in this right and this language, partly because of what's going on in the world, which is a clear acceleration in science and technology and a convergence also of science and technology, which makes it quite a powerful mix. And so we haven't really clear ideas or I guess a template or very solid method for doing global governance with science technology. And so we are looking for ideas. And I think human rights, or the human right to science, is a great tool for that purpose. So with that in mind, where to start in the analysis of this provision? Duty of cooperation is not something that pertains only to science, but there is a general obligation under the UN Charter for nations to cooperate. This is the language in Article 155-56. Fundamentally, what I want to highlight here is there is a duty to cooperate for the respect of human rights, but also to identify solutions of international economic, social, and health and related problems. So we're going to come back and look at these two pieces of the puzzle a bit later. An obligation to cooperate in the realization of human rights and one to solve international problems. So that's 1945. Since then, it is considered to be a moment in history, not only of international law, but broadly in international relations, of transition from coexistence to cooperation, where states before 1945 coexisted, recognizing each other. And in 1945, the movement was one of cooperation, where we need to move from just being together, part of the international community, and trying to work with each other to work toward peace and human well-being and some of the goals that the Raoul Wallenberg Institute is pursuing. I think there is a question whether we're still in time of cooperation. Maybe we get there at the end, but certainly there was a clear transition in the 1940s. As a result of that, in 1966, when the covenant that contains the language that I'm analyzing was adopted, cooperation was also made its way in the covenant in Article 2.1, where each state undertakes to take steps individually or through international assistance and cooperation towards the full realization of the rights recognized in the present covenant, including cultural rights and the right to science. 1970 is reinforced by the Friendly Declaration on Relations, and then there was a Charter of Rights and Duties of the United States adopted by and also a resolution by the UN General Assembly in 2004. So there is a institutional recognition of cooperation throughout the years. Now, if you look at the scholarship on cooperation, the general duty, it is clear that there is a minimum duty to engage with other states. That's what cooperation is. But in 2011, the scholars are still puzzled by what it means. So in 2011, a title of a paper, The International Obligation to Cooperate, an Empty Shell or Hard Law Principle of International Law. So we questioned to what extent this is a principle that is part of also the constitutional order of international law, human rights law. And then as recently as 5 years ago, a review by Chazurne and Rudal concluded that the content of the general duty remains unclear. So we really don't know exactly what the obligations are if states were to take these obligations seriously, assuming they do. What it means is that we don't have a clear sense of what is called the normative content of this obligation, and we need to therefore do some work to move away from the general recognition to a more specific set of contents to this obligation. So what the scholars tend to do is to think of cooperation in the context of specific fields or subfields of international law, different regimes of international law. So then cooperation makes sense if you start looking at environmental law, regulation of the oceans, the space, human rights. And so the focus is really much more interesting if we think about cooperation in the field of science technology is supposed to try thinking in very general terms what that means. So that's where the literature is going, and that's where my thinking is also going. If you look at the literature, there's actually not much written, and there's only really a book that is coming out now in January or February that is the first really attempt to sort of look at this issue. I'm going to quote that a little bit later. So in the absence really of clear legal parameter, it's an open field, and so I guess a good starting point is really to think about science in general and what does it mean to cooperate in science. One starting point is this sort of used and abused quote by Louis Pasteur, and the idea is that he had this idea that science has no homeland. I think the French is a bit more interesting, and say that in a second, but you can read the quotes in French. What they say is that science doesn't have a homeland because it's part of the common heritage of humanity. The flame that lights in the world is very poetic. And then science has no homeland, or more clearly, the homeland of science is the entire humanity. It's interesting, I think I put the dates first to place them historically, and second also to put some context. Actually, the conference in Milano was the first time Pasteur was ever invited to an international conference. So that was his sort of business cards when he approached the international community to present himself as a man of sort of global science. I also want to make a comment about Pasteur himself, that he's not necessarily a model of a good science in 2025. I want to acknowledge that too. There's a lot of issues, scientific integrity and manipulation and other things. I think there is still value in thinking historically about his contribution. And this is a quote that has been, if you research it, has been really used many, many times. So the French patrie, which is also Romance language, is patria in Italian and in other languages, it really, I think, really has two connotations, and I know there's a couple of French people in the room that can correct me, but I think it calls to a connection between a person or science and the origins of that, and that's the question, the issue of motherland or fatherland. So a patrie or homeland can be the result of where the parents or the ancestor lived, or can also be more an allegiance, where you find yourself in an environment in which you would be aligned with in terms of value and interest. So I think it has this sort of dual meaning of being both a place of origin and a place of allegiance. So if science has no homeland, then it doesn't have origins in a particular state and doesn't have the allegiance to a particular state. So that creates interesting questions for international cooperation if science is not necessarily a business of nations or national interests per se. Now, once you start opening up the box, it gets quite interesting, and I have some visuals later. This is sort of, I start from the most maybe provocative and recent and less nation-oriented. This is an Excel file that codes the members of the Meta superintelligence team. So this is Silicon Valley. What is interesting, I think, there are a lot of interesting things, but one is the second column has the nationality. As you can see, there's a lot of Chinese scientists working for Meta in California, and there's a lot of second generation, mostly Chinese, children of Chinese immigrants who also work for Meta in Silicon Valley. So if you just look at the development AI, it's certainly a global business, because you have the intermingling of geography and nationality that makes it quite a colorful puzzle. And you can look around, there are some national also from other parts of the world. There are not many Americans in developing AI for Meta. Now, the group has been reshuffled a little bit in the last few weeks. This is from August. You know, Jan LeCun has left and a few other people have left, but certainly the Chinese element is still strongly there. So if that's, I think Excel file tells you one thing, is that certainly it's a description of science works and technology, but it's not a business of nationals working for a national company or university or research institute in delivering national science or science of national interest. So just a few slides. I don't think I have to make the case, but if you look at the Human Genome Project, so we're looking at 25 to 30 years ago, started in 1988, is the result of 20 different universities coming together from United States, United Kingdom, France, Germany, Japan, and China. So very, very international project from 1989 until 2000, and then sort of fading out. Then this is a map of the international scientific collaboration that came out of COVID for biomedical research. This OECD data, this is 2021, and you can see the network connecting countries with bigger or smaller circles, but there's I haven't counted them, but it looks like there is 40 to 50 countries at least in this web of biomedical research. This is the share of the percentage of publications that is the result of international collaboration. So if you look at the affiliation of the authors, there's authors in multiple countries, 2 or more countries. It's not the majority of publication. I think it's like 30 to 40% of the of what is published. So the majority of publications are still national, if you wish, or national affiliation. And that's also true for the single author publications. But I think you can see the trend of going up. So certainly there is a wave of international cooperation or collaborations that are taking place. And that's, again, the OECD data from last year. But the data go back to 2020. It works also at the regional level. I mean, I think my talk is going to be a bit polarized on the United States and China, as you can see. But some of these arguments can be made for other regions of the world. So this is the connection of Central and Latin America, of scientific cooperation. Nature, the scientific weekly journal, publishes every year a report, and this is data from that report. So in this landscape, where science has no homeland as a fact, so a description of how science operates, we can say that science is an inherently global enterprise just because of the data that I'm showing you, and there can be many, many others. It's also a multi-actor enterprise, which makes it quite complex. So in addition to the rate or the speed at which technology and science are moving and the convergence, there's also certainly other aspects of the change in the global science enterprise, which is the rise of multi-actors. So there's a lot of private companies, a lot of research institutes that are not necessarily affiliated with academia or government. And there's also transactional actors that are working in this enterprise as part of this enterprise. So if you look at the right, I try to tease out the fact that there is collaborations or coalition, which are primarily among scientists or scientific organization, research organization, and then there's the idea of cooperation, which is more the involvement of nations or institutions, public institutions. So we can separate a bit the idea of collaboration from cooperation. So I don't want to conflate them, but certainly there are two aspects of the global science enterprise that are, certainly synergic and partly overlapping. Now, one way in which this is guided is through what is called science diplomacy, which is diplomacy, an aspect of diplomacy which connects to science as seeing science as a vehicle for diplomatic actions. And the Fulbright program is a great example, bringing American scholars to other parts of the world, and it's an act of soft power on part of the United States, and also inviting scholars to the United States for the friendly relations of countries. But it's also diplomacy incorporating science or scientific advice, and so the different aspects. Science diplomacy is a long history, and so part of this collaboration and cooperation are shaped by diplomatic relations, so by nations cooperating in diplomatic fora. So that's important to recognize that it's partly legal, but there's also many other considerations go into that. Now, it is a description, but it's also a rather imperfect description. So we're going to the second part of the idea of science has no homeland. If you read what Pasteur said in these two conferences, the two sentences that followed the claim that science has no homeland were actually rather different in tone and content. So in the first, in Milano, what he said right after said, science must be the highest personification of the state or the homeland. And second, if science doesn't have any homeland, then the man of science must have the preoccupation of everything that makes the glory of his or her homeland. So we go back immediately into thinking about national affiliation and so sort of the idea of allegiance that I was talking about earlier. So there is certainly nationalism in science. And so in talking about corporations of nations in science technology, it's unavoidable also to think about the role of nationalism in science. So these are just two titles from this week. Financial Times from November 28th, is China winning the innovation race? And then The Economist a couple of days before or later, what China will dominate next? High-speed innovation, whole lessons for the world. And you literally can find these kind of titles on a daily basis, certainly every week. This idea that there's a race among countries, that there's a sort of a prize of a goal. Today is AI, tomorrow maybe quantum or other form of technology, and yesterday was genomic and genetics, developing the internet, things like that. And so we are constantly in a race. So these are just four snapshots, and again, there could be many. We think, the point of this visualization is that we think in terms of national interest whenever we think about science. So starting from the top left, we measure investment of countries in science in terms of fraction of GDP. We have AI chips and their computing power, and we think the most powerful chips out there are in the United States and then in China. We have the Nobel Prize winners, a little bit tribute to Sweden. We definitely think about the nationality of the winners of the Nobel Prize, particularly as an American. I think Berkeley won 4 or 5 this year alone. Most of them were not born in the United States, but certainly they became Americans. They work in an American university. And then I think there's a more drastic data there. If you look just at the annual patent applications with China just coming out of in the late 2000s and activating its sort of market economy to a scale that it was never seen before. So we like to see this data. They make sense to us in thinking about science. In part, and so I think I will give you a couple of examples also. I'm not going to ask you to read about these quotes by President Trump. This comes from the 60-minute interview from early November. And essentially what he says that, well, we have the most powerful chips in the world, and we're going to give them to China, but not the most powerful, just the second best, which you can see from the previous slide. And then in the last quote, what he says something interesting. We are a treat to them being China. Many of the things they say, we do to them. Look, there's a very competitive world, especially when it comes to China and the US, and we're always watching them. They're always watching us. In the meantime, I think we get along very well. I think it is, and I think we can get bigger, better, and stronger by working with them, as opposed to just knocking them out. So the idea of cooperation is there, but then concludes that, and we are leading the AI race right now by a lot. The AI race is a big deal. So these two elements of cooperation and competition are certainly there in contemporary politics. On the other side of the world, the narrative is not particularly different. So President Xi addressed I don't remember if it was the National Academy of Chinese Science or a meeting of scientists. In the face of the fierce international competition and against the backdrop of rising unilateralism and protectionism, we must take a path to innovation that suits our national conditions. So there's an argument for nationalism. Science has no borders. You go back to Pasteur, but scientists have a motherland. The historic achievements of our country, scientific and technological undertakings, are the result of generation after generation of scientists who have dedicated themselves to serving the country. And then it goes to quote some of the greatest Chinese scientists. I think we can go around the world and fish for very similar quotes. These are the two leading powers in science technology nowadays, science and technology. You know, Europe is a powerhouse of science, not much of technology. And so I think you find the rhetoric pretty much everywhere, and it's not new. So if you go back in the history, when you can argue that maybe modern Western science came out of Italy with the Renaissance, and then the French and the English wanted to borrow the model, and then it came to the Germans to understand how the French and English was successful, and then it was the German again looking at the French again looking at the Germans and trying to emulate their success, and then the Americans, the Russians came. So if you look at the last century and a half, we have this sort of nationalist model of thinking about science. So this is an article from 1970 from an American sociology of science, Norman Storer. And on the right you have a book written by Harry Paul that traces the history of the desire of the French scientists really to learn the secret ingredients of the German scientists in the second part of the 19th century, the sorcerer's apprentice. What is the source of their magic? As an imperfect description where it leaves us, so certainly national policy is very important in the structure of science. Science is funded by national governments primarily. Scientists are professionals and have working careers in a certain country typically. Some have dual affiliations, but most of the people work somewhere and they pay taxes there and are citizens and vote in a certain country. The institutional affiliation, it's always a national one. There are very few scientists who work in international organizations, but there are some. Second, science technology are tools to advance national interests and objectives. I think the race to the moon was a great example. There's a nice quote of President Kennedy also, "The science has no homeland," given to the National Science Academy, where he was praising the achievement of American scientists. It's a way to gain a competitive advantage, whether in AI, in quantum, even in COVID, we saw that certainly there was a race to develop a vaccine that was not easily accessible to countries other than those where they had the science. There's also a national security element to that. There are sensitive technologies. We want to make sure that as a government we can control who accesses them and who uses them. This idea of sovereignty, of independence also, that's also valued politically as a political currency. So the science ecosystem are structured primarily at the national level. There is this ambition of science or this description of science as global, but it's always with feet deeply rooted in national systems. So the combination of two, I think, creates some push and pull factors. There are some factors that push scientists and nations to cooperate, and some that pull in and some that push away from that. Tools for pushing away are export controls, national security restraints, the idea of data sovereignty and other forms of tech sovereignty. But the pull factors are, there's a lot of transnational issues that need to be researched with international teams of scientists. They're global problems, they're just too complex to be solved or addressed by any particular nation. There's an obligation to transfer technology that's written in international law. The problem of brain drain, scientists move around, and so we need to coordinate also that part too. So there's more push and pull factors, but the idea is that I think international cooperation at the center of this effort of country to themselves mediate their own desire to be part of the system and be out of the system. So here is the reconstructive part, what to do with that in terms of legal analysis. So one approach, I propose two approaches. The first one is to propose a minimalist account of this duty to cooperate. I recently read an article that talks about co-opetition, so cooperation and competition together. It's a game theory concept. And so states in that framework, states will engage in international cooperation only when they cannot realize their interests unilaterally. So that's a minimalistic approach where, okay, we cannot solve this problem, or we need this and that, and therefore we're going to engage in cooperation to obtain powerful microchips, to obtain a genome of COVID. We're going to see in the next slide. I think it combines the national interest, the alignment with national interest, in the idea of subsidiarity, that cooperation is subsidiary to the sort of national policy. A complement to that, it can all be activated as in a subsidiary fashion. And this idea of strategic sovereignty, which is sort of a European idea that we want to be as sovereign as we can, and be strategic about cooperation so that we can activate cooperation. We cannot, achieve sovereignty unilaterally. There is this movement in science diplomacy called transactional science diplomacy. These are very influential writers that wrote in Science this summer. This idea that then everything is transactional. What do you need that I can give you? What can you give me back? And I think this entire discussion of President Trump and the rare minerals is a great example of that. And so I think a co-opetition or strategic cooperation, strategic sovereignty, transactional side diplomacy, that's where we are. And maybe that's what Article 15 of the Covenant really says. That's totally state practice. So what cannot be realized unilateral? Maybe the sharing the genome at the beginning of pandemic, that's what happened in COVID, and you see all this network of countries connected. Maybe the climate science needs a science policy interface like the IPCC. We need CERN because we can't really create a particle accelerator with the funds of a single government, although I think China is trying now. Maybe we need to pool resources, like in the case of the human genome. It was so expensive and slow to map the human genome that was actually outsourced in 20 different universities. Everybody did a little bit of that, and then they will send in the data at the end of the day in a common repository. There are also some transnational interests. There are emerging technologies that cannot be regulated effectively by a single country. I think heritable human gene editing is a great story of that. There's the birth of the twins by these Chinese scientists. One of the aspects of the story is that it turns out that these men travel around the world. They get a lot of legal advice from the United States, from Europe. So it's a global story, even if it's rooted in China. In some of the lack or relaxed regulation at that time, But then once you have these gene-edited children, then the gene is out of the bottle, and that's consequences for the entire globe. And so maybe we need a transnational cooperation to engage in realizing our transnational interests. And also the science mobility, science travel, we need to coordinate that, passports, conferences, transfer of data and samples and things like that. We just need to recognize that that's an essential part of doing science, even in the national interests. So that could be one account. It's not my favorite. So the first one is really to move to an aspiration. I want to make sure I don't go over my time. So maybe that's an aspiration. It's not a statement of fact, but it's something we need to think as a ideal or a possibility. So if that's the case, then it's a more demanding obligation if the idea of a science there's no homeland is something we need to achieve beyond just scientific collaboration and engaging in this sort of transactional form of cooperation. And so it's demanding really the realization of the human right to science in full scale. That's really what Article 15.4 really means. The article, the human right to science is codified in 1B, so in the same article a bit earlier, and cooperation is a tool for realizing the human right to science. So how do we get there? There are three ways to get there for the legal scholars in the room. One is what we have done in our book and we left out, so I may go back and do that in the spring, which is just from the ground up, look at all the recognitions of international cooperation in normative instrument, whether a soft or hard law instrument, and try to make a case for a non-minimalistic account of scientific cooperation. The second one is just to reaffirm the general duty, which includes an obligation to realize all human rights, which include the right to science. Unfortunately, the general duty is undetermined, so that's going to be a long way to create to work on the general duty to then work on a specific human right. But that can be another way. The third way I borrow from Samantha Besson. She has been writing on this for about 10 years. And she's a philosopher of human rights, of law, and so she's very deductive. And she starts from the question of what are we trying to do here? What is the good where we are protecting by having this human right? And her answer is that science is a collective participatory good, and so the duty of cooperation is about creating and enhancing or making this collective participatory good grow. What is a collective good? What is a participatory good? So science is value, it's a public good because we all is conducted and enjoyed together. Wherever you are around the world, you are part of the scientific enterprise, but you're also enjoying the benefits of that, whether you're a scientist or not. It also requires the active participation of more than one person in order for science to exist. A person publishing a paper is not doing science. You need another person to verify those results and consider them to be reliable. So the collective and participatory nature of science requires interactions, and it's inherently something where we enjoy together. So based on that, we have a communal responsibility to care for this good. And if so, then we have an obligation to international scientific cooperation as part of this collective obligation, community obligation of nations to cultivate this valuable good that has been enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I will call this a form of participatory cooperation to oppose it to this co-opetition or minimalistic cooperation. So I think that's the true spirit of the idea of the science as no homeland, to go back to this idea of this collective participatory good. So a couple more slides. One is, Samantha Besson writes, we need to participate for the good of science itself rather than approach as an instrument of protection of other interests. So cooperation is for the good of science, not to achieve other interests. And so what is science? What is science protected by in human rights? If I have to sum up our 900-page book, it would be this sentence. So it's innovation that must occur responsibly and participatorily and for the benefits of all. That's what science and human rights really means. And so cooperation is one that has guaranteed that innovation, science, technology occur in a responsible fashion, participatorily, and for the benefit of all. So cooperation must be one that guarantees the basic freedoms of scientists, fundamental human dignity and other human rights, the involvement of the public in participation, and ensure that the benefits reach all, every individual around the world through technology transfer or other means. So I'm going to work on filling out in the spring the content of this obligation. But what is the future obligation, particularly in this really fragmented world where a lot of people say that multilateralism is dead or at least in deep crisis. So what's the point of thinking about human rights in this particular historical junction? So from a legal perspective, one way to think about it is try to institutionalize this duty. That's what Samantha Besson is doing. This is consistent with the idea of the global administrative law, create a body of law called the Public International Law of Science that would articulate these principles. One piece of that, and that's how we conclude our book our book on the human right to science, is to have a treaty. I found this interesting article from 1967 by Wilfred Jenks, who was soon to be appointed to be the Director General of ILO, who advocated for that. It's interesting because, so the 45, 48, you have the enshrining of science as human rights. When in 66 was codified. And in 75, the General Assembly had a declaration on the use of scientific technological progress in the interest of peace and benefit of mankind. And Jenks in 67 said, well, first we need the General Assembly, and then after the General Assembly says this is a duty of nations, then we can come back and have a treaty negotiation on that, which never occurred. So we are in 75 nowadays. We are 50 years later, but we're in 1975 in terms of development of a trajectory. Now, what happened in the meanwhile is that the human right to science was essentially forgotten almost. I want to give credit to the few scholars who work on that between 66 and 2009. But in 2009, there was a revival of interest. So it's fairly recent, it's 15 years old. In the last 10 years, there's been 15 to 20 scholars are working on that. So this renaissance of interest is an opportunity to, I think, go back and think about this forgotten obligation to cooperation and think how it fits in the entire system of human rights, the unfinished trajectory laid out in 48, 66, and 75, and make a case for some international negotiation around science. Maybe it's a bit of an utopia. It's also lawyers come up with the best idea lawyers have is to create more law, which may be a self-fulfilling prophecy, I'm not sure. So should we give multilateralism a chance? I think multilateralism is not dead. There have been at least two significant steps forward in the last couple of years. One is the pandemic treaty or a core agreement, and then also WIPO had a treaty, the first treaty in more than 20 years on traditional knowledge. So there is an opportunities for multilateralism, or at least plurilateralism are there. And I think it begs the question really, and that's really my final thought, whether or not human rights scholars and even advocates are too naive about what human rights law can do, and maybe even more broadly international law. I think I heard this a couple of times since I've been here, people asking this question. I don't know the answer, and maybe it's good to be naive. But one, the parting thought I have is that when I think the Universal Declaration is an amazing achievement in the history of human civilization. In less than 2 years, the world came together and was able to distill a list of fundamental rights for everybody. There were, less than 60 nations at that time. The war had ended. The losers were not in the room. So there were a lot of good reason why it worked, but it worked. And John Humphrey was the secretary of the drafting committee, and here is a picture with Eleanor Roosevelt. And when the declaration was adopted, what he said over the years after, and he stayed involved with the United Nations and human rights, he called it the beginning of a great adventure. So the human rights are not meant to be answers for today, I think. They're meant to be open-ended, and every generation will find their own value in them. And so it's an excellent framework to inspire to better things, and I think it was meant to be that way. It's an adventure, it's whatever we want to take it. And so I think there should be space for utopia, naivete, constant station, and trying to use them to build a better world, as opposed to be just a what is called a transactional or a competitive world. So that's my message. So these are my thoughts. Thank you for listening, and thank you for coming.